Morning, everybody. My name is Johannes Urpelainen. I'm a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I'm also the founding director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, or ISEP. I'm just going to give it a few more minutes to let people trickle in, and then after that, we will start the presentation and discussion. I will provide the instructions for how to ask questions and everything. Excellent. Okay, why don't we get started? We are approaching 150 participants, so I would assume that the trickle will continue for a few more minutes. Good morning, everybody. My name is Johannes Urpelainen. I'm the Prince Sultan Abdulaziz Professor of Energy Resources and Environment and the founding director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, or ISEP, here at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Today, I'm very happy to launch our new report on China's Belt and Road and sustainability aspects of the initiative, together with our partners at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford University, and with support from ClimateWorks Foundation. I have my co-authors. I have Professor Tom Hale from Oxford here with us, and I have Dr. Chiu Liu, who's a postdoctoral fellow with my group here at the Johns Hopkins SAIS. So the way we're going to do this today is I'm going to, first of all, start the presentation. Tom and Juyu are going to give the presentation. I am going to request that if you have any questions in the audience, please use the Q&A function. You can type your questions there anytime, and I will keep track of them, and I will then moderate the questions after the presentation. If there are some clarifying questions, I might take them during the presentation, but most of them will be right at the end of the presentation. So please use the Q&A function. If you have any difficulty, you can always ping me in the chat window. And Professor Hale has now shared also the link to the report itself. So if you want to download the all 100 pages of text, you can go and read it there. And this webinar will also be recorded. The recording will be shared with all the participants and other audiences after our session is done. Okay. So now I'm going to start my screen share. I will share the presentation that we have. Okay. And if you have any difficulty seeing the presentation, please do let me know. It should show up on your screen. Tom and Juyu, can you see the presentation? Yes, perfect. Okay, excellent. Okay, so what we're going to do today is, first of all, we are just going to have a brief overview of the project. What were the key objectives of this research? What were the questions that we were trying to answer? And after that overview, we are going to move into a discussion of key findings and recommendations from the project. Okay. And so with that, I'd like to hand it to my co-authors.
Thank you, Johannes. So our objective in this report is to try to understand the decision-making processes around Belt and Road projects and how and when and where opportunities to increase the sustainability, the greening of those projects, if you will, might arise. So if I could take you back in time, we're now all sitting here on a webinar from our different homes, but a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, in late April 2019, China hosted the largest international summit it had hosted to date, which was the second Belt and Road Forum. And at that forum, there was a big push by the Chinese government to enhance the greening of BRI as a larger project around enhancing the governance and the sustainability and the quality of BRI projects. And President Xi Jinping said, for example, we should pursue the new vision of a green development and a way of life and work that's green, low carbon, circular, and sustainable. And now, a year after that, we know that this vision for greening investment projects in the BRI countries and across the world is all the more important in our time reacting to the COVID-19 crisis. As governments begin to invest huge economic stimulus packages into the economy, we know it's a critical juncture for the sustainability challenge. If those investments go into the brown old categories, it will be locking in a development pathway that will certainly break our global climate goals. But if, on the other hand, they're using those stimulus packages to invest in green new industries, that will be exactly the kind of push we need to accelerate the transition toward global sustainability. So this critical juncture that we saw emerging last year is really all the more critical now in the face of the COVID crisis. And of course, we don't know yet what shape those packages will take. We don't know how the Belt and Road project will develop. We certainly don't think it will be the same as before, although we already see China talking about the Health Silk Road as a way to respond to the emerging crisis. Certainly, we do know that outward Chinese investment will perhaps slow down, but will certainly not stop and will continue. And therefore, this discussion around greening Belt and Road is going to be a critical part of the broader discussion around how we move to build back better, in the words of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who had an op-ed in this New York Times this morning promoting this exact case of how to green our build back plans. So if I go to the next slide, you can see why exactly that's so important. This is a report from Tsinghua University, and you don't have to speak Chinese to understand the message of this report. The red line shows you business as usual. The green line on the bottom shows you the 2-degree target we're all trying to get to. But the orange line in the middle shows what would happen if all the other countries in the world moved toward a 2-degree pathway, but the Belt and Road countries still continued on a business as usual path. And what you can see is that it exceeds globally what we need to do to achieve 2 degrees by 68%. So we know we need to get Belt and Road projects moving in the direction of enhancing sustainability if we're going to have a chance of maintaining climate change to acceptable levels. So that's the risk we face. But next slide talks about the opportunities we might see. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the opportunities are just as big. Currently, most of the investments we've seen historically by Chinese outward bound investment have gone into dirty industries, into the coal industry, into other fossil fuel projects. The vast majority of energy investments by state-owned enterprises in particular were going into fossil fuels. But we also see some huge opportunity here because a lot of the private investment that's flown out of China has gone into renewable energy projects. This is important information coming from our good colleagues at Boston University and the World Resources Institute who have looked at all these projects in detail. So there's a huge opportunity here to get the Building Back program right if the Belt and Road is beginning to move in the right direction on green questions. And if we just think about the comparison to multilateral development banks, which have targeted to provide 25% of their portfolios as climate finance in the coming years, if Belt and Road matched that, it would be huge additional investment in the kind of finance we need, all the more important now. Next slide, please. So the question is, how do we make that happen? What are the steps we're taking to ensure that we can move toward this vision that was laid out at the second Belt and Road Forum last year of greening BRI? What do we actually do? So obviously there's a huge amount written about this question, but the gap we're trying to fill in the present report is to really delve into detail onto the decision-making processes around Belt and Road projects. How are we actually deciding what gets built and how it gets built and how it gets implemented? So our focus is on decision-making, the sort of black box of who decides what and why they do what they do. So in the report, we're trying to answer really 4 questions. First, how do we understand the Belt and Road Initiative as a whole? Secondly, who are the relevant actors and what are their interests, both inside China and inside countries? And also go into a bit of more detail into 5 recipient countries, which we thought were particularly significant cases: Malaysia, Kenya, Pakistan, Indonesia. Sorry, Pakistan is there twice. Kazakhstan is the other country there. We also want to understand not just who the actors and their interests are, but what are the processes through which these decisions get made? What is the institutional setting around them? Which interactors interact with which other actors? Who can influence whom? Who has the power to influence different aspects of the decision-making process? That kind of power mapping, if you will, is really key to unpacking the decision-making process in the way we want to do in the report. And finally, in the report, we try to answer the question of what should we do with the current decision-making processes to improve entry points for sustainability. And we'll come back to these in the end of our presentation, but basically we have 3 recommendations around increasing capacity, increasing control, and increasing coordination. Next slide, please. So let me, before I pass to my colleague Chuyu, just say a bit more about how we conceptualize BRI as a whole in this project. And all of you who are on this call are probably experts, so you're not going to be surprised by what we're going to say, but it's striking how the message is lost often in public discourse or even in relatively sophisticated policymaking scenario settings. So we obviously want to see BRI not as a specific plan or as a single project, but rather as a framework campaign that builds on existing patterns in Chinese outward investment. And that's important because it means that to understand the nature of decision-making, we have to actually look in quite a lot of detail at who the individual actors are, what their interests are, and what the specific institutional arrangements and interactions they're engaging with are. This is not a way to understand how projects get made without going to that granular level of detail. So you can think about this in a bit of the international relations theory framework as moving from a kind of 2-level games model, which would have the principal agency as between nation states. You know, China negotiates with another country over some sort of deal, and maybe domestic interest groups are important for constraining whether those deals can be implemented or influencing what the country as a whole wants. That's a kind of traditional IR setting. We want to instead suggest that BRI is better viewed through what we might call a reverse 2-level games framework, where the primary agency actually operates at the domestic level or in transnational relations between interest groups in China and recipient countries. They're the ones who decide on projects, they're the ones who push them up in most cases. And those might then interact with the international politics around them. Domestic bargaining operates within the opportunity structures created by the larger strategic interests around BRI, larger relations between China and recipient countries. But those are the kind of broad contours, not the things that actually decide what project happens where. So we really want to drill down onto this question of who decides what, when, and how. And that's what the report tries to do. So let me pass now to my colleague Chuyu to talk us through a bit more about what that looks like in the Chinese policymaking apparatus. And we're going to focus on that part in this presentation because we don't have time to go into all of the 5 recipient countries, but I do encourage you to look at the information in the report to have a bit more detail there. So Chuyu, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. So for BRI actors in China, we can divide them into 2 groups. The first group is about the regulators in China. So this figure maps the relationship between different regulators in China as a hierarchy. So at the top of the hierarchy, there is a small leading group of BRI, which is chaired by Han Zheng, who is a member of the Standing Committee of Politburo, which is the top leadership of Chinese Communist Party. So although in theory, this small leading group is the most powerful regulator of BRI projects, in reality, the group members do not meet frequently, and the day-to-day management of the BRI project have been delegated to the 3 constituent ministries of the small leading group. So which have been shown at the second layer of the hierarchy. From left to right, these 3 constituent ministries are the MOFCOM, Ministry of Commerce, NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission, and MFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Among the 3 constituent ministries, NDRC, the box in the middle is the most important one. Is in charge of the coordination of various BRI regulators in China and also share the power with MOFCOM, the Ministry of Commerce, to approve the China's major overseas investment project. For MOFCOM, in addition to share the power with NDRC to approve the major investment project overseas, the MOFCOM previously also managed China's foreign aid system. And now this function has been shifted to a new established agency called CIDCA. And you can tell that the MOFCOM and the NDRC are the more important actors among the three constituent ministries. On the other hand, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the MFA, plays a relatively minor role among the three. And these ministries tend to jump in the decision-making process when there's a trouble occurred and it needs the diplomatic assistance of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At the bottom of the hierarchy, we also lay out some other secondary regulators of BRI in China. And because of the interest of the same time, we will not go into the details of them. Our report gives the detailed information about each of them. So what we want to highlight here is the MEE, or Ministry of Ecology and Environment, plays no formal role in the approval of BRI project, which demonstrates that the sustainability consideration may be marginalized among the major BRI regulators in China, which we can see this in more detail in next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So if you look at this table here, if you look at the column on the far right, which shows the sustainability consideration for each of the major BRI regulators in China, for NDRC, the coordinator of the BRI regulators, is originally the NDRC is a more domestic-oriented economic agencies. It is responsible for China's industry policy and macroeconomic management. So its main interest lies in China's domestic economy, and these domestic consideration trump overseas influence. For example, in terms of the regulation of China's coal power plants, which is very important for nowadays the climate change issue, the NDRC restricts the construction of new coal power plants in China domestically, while it have not limited the export of the coal power plants to other developing countries, which demonstrate that the domestic considerations are really important for NDRC. And for MOFCOM, the Ministry of Commerce, the main policy goal of this regulator is to promote China's export. So again, using the example of coal power plants, MOFCOM have no incentive against the export of coal power plants because its main policy goal is to do that. So the sustainability consideration might be only important for the MFA because the environmental controversy associated with the BRI projects in developing country may damage China's national image, and the MFA that have the incentive to take into account the sustainability consideration. However, as we have talked about, the MFA plays a relatively minor role or less powerful role than NDRC and MOFCOM. We will talk about the role, the extent to which sustainability consideration affect the behavior of SESEC, the first major regulator of BRI actors. It's a direct regulator of China's largest central SOE or state-owned enterprise. It's the regulators of the state-owned enterprise later. So next slides, please. Next slides, please. Okay, so, go back to the, please, thanks. So now we have talked about the BRI regulators. The second group, BRI actor group, is the project developers in China. And these project developers include the policy banks and state-owned enterprise or SOE as major players. So in China, there are two major policy banks for China's overseas projects. The first is Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank. The second is China Development Bank, the CDB. So both two policy banks provide the majority of capital to finance China's overseas projects. To put this into perspective, the two policy banks provide as much financing to developing countries as what the World Bank does, according to some estimation, or even more than what World Bank does. And for SOEs, they're also very important for China's overseas project. They play a very important role in project development and implementation. For example, right now, China have around more than 100 central level SOEs, which owned by the central government. And for these more than 100 central SOEs, there are more than 15,000 overseas subsidiaries of these central SOEs, which are a lot of these firms located outside of China and engage in these overseas projects. And until quite recently, the SOEs account for a majority of China's outward foreign direct investment. So these are very important actors. In terms of sustainability considerations, based on our interviews with the staff in these policy banks and China's major SOEs, it appears that these sustainability considerations are secondary to their main interests. The reason is they tend to think about the environmental, social, governance norms kind of limit their business opportunity overseas. So for example, for the policy banks, they provide a lot of money for the infrastructure projects in developing countries. And these projects, the payback period is long and the return to the investment is low. So it's really very costly for the policy bank to conduct the on-site environmental review or evaluations, which I think is not that great for them in terms of the economic interests. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we have to talk about the BRI actors, the BRI regulators, and the project developers. So you want to know how does these actors engage in the decision-making process of the BRI. And this flow chart gives you a kind of snapshot or dynamic view of a typical BRI project from the beginning to the end. You can think about it's like a life cycle of a typical BRI project. So we divide the whole process into 5 stages. The first stage is project initiation. The second stage is project financing, and then move on to project approval. And then it's project implementation on the ground. And finally, they have some troubleshooting. So notice that the first 4 stages are common to most BRI projects, while the last stage, the troubleshooting, is only be specific to these projects. They have troubles in the host country. They face the setbacks from local actors, may be suspended after the implementation. And for each stage, we highlight the key actors in both China and the recipient country engage in each stage. And because of the consideration about time, we'll only want to single out the first stage for today's discussion, the project initiation. So in terms of the project initiation, we can think about 2 typical scenarios. The first scenario is kind of, sort of like the bottom up kind of process. Is the Chinese company win a tender bid set up by the host country government and then initiate the project, which is mainly driven by the commercial interests of the business consideration. This actually accounts for a majority of BRI projects as we know. And the second type of process, which is different from the first one, is more top-down. So for this top-down process, is usually the host country government have some idea, try to pre-planned idea of large-scale infrastructure projects that require a lot of capital and scale, but the host country government do not have these capital, the money, the scale, the resource to do it. So they invite or seek the help of the Chinese government to jump in. And the Chinese government want to do this is mainly because of the geopolitical considerations or strategic interests. But these are not the majority of the BI project based on our interview with the stakeholders of various BI projects. So this is kind of the two different scenarios for the project initiation and the associated actors. Next slide, please. And so to what extent do the sustainability consideration appear in the decision-making process of the BRI? What we try to argue in the report based on our interview is that there is a discrepancy between the general framework and the more concrete practice among the decision-making process. On the one hand, various Chinese regulators, which we list here, as you can see, from State Council to SESEC to CBIRC is the regulator of the banking and the insurance system. So they issued a bunch of guidelines, try to incorporate the sustainability consideration into the decision-making process. But on the other hand, these efforts have not been fully connected to the practice on the ground. We argue that there are two reasons for this. The first is because of the incentive of the project developer, the policy banks, and the state-owned enterprise. So as we have discussed briefly, for example, the policy banks, they think about, they conduct these environmental review is way too costly for them. So they have the economic interest to not do that. And the second reason is not because of the incentive of the project developer, it's because of lack of the capacity, the supervisory capacity of the regulators. So for example, we talk about there are more than 15,000 overseeing subsidiaries of the central level SOE in China, but the regulator of the central SOE, the SESEC, they only have usually between 1 and 2 permanent officers be sent out to monitor each of these central SOE. And the other bureaucrats working for the job to do the supervising of the central SOE, the total number is less than 100 staffs. So it's really an understaffing problem or lack of the capacity to oversee these more than tens of thousands of the overseas branches of the companies, really compromise the regulators' capacity to implement, even if they want to do these kind of sustainability considerations. Okay, so Tom, I think you can, based on our discussion, to make the policy recommendations.
Thank you, Chiyu. So as Chiyu said, our findings really show some of the patterns at a general level for the BRI decision-making. And the question is what we do with that information. How do we then think about moving this very, very large, disaggregated, heterogeneous set of decision-making processes in some better direction? So there's been some good steps forward at the last Belt and Road Forum. As I started our discussion by mentioning, there was a clear direction from the top to move toward greening. That's a very kind of abstract and general movement and direction to travel in, but an important rhetorical win to point toward and to build on. And since that time, we've also seen a huge number of principles emerging. For example, the Green BRI principles. So lots of different actors in China and China's partners are setting these kinds of standards for what green projects might look like. The key message of our report is that to make progress on this, we need to move beyond kind of a general direction from the high political level and move beyond just principles and look really in detail at the implementation and incentives that individual actors in China and in recipient countries have around sustainability. That's where these 3 sets of recommendations, capacity, coordination, and control come from. How do we move incentives and implementation on the ground? And I should just say that we're not expecting this kind of decision to be something that the leadership in China is going to invest a lot of political capital in the short term. There's a lot happening in the world and in China, as we know. And so we think we shouldn't be waiting for some sort of top-down directive to come from the top leadership, but the leadership has given that signal of direction of where they'd like to go. And the question now becomes how to build support across the Chinese policy system and in recipient countries to actually shift the actors' incentives in the way we're thinking. So that's the direction and the spirit of our recommendations. Let me quickly run through them. So first, we need to increase capacity. As Chu, you mentioned, for BRI projects, personnel really is policy. If you don't have enough people to monitor and you don't have people in place who have the skills and training to do environmental assessments well, both in the finance institutions and in the regulators, then you're not going to have sustainable outcomes because you don't have the people in place with the skills they need to deliver those kinds of outcomes. So we need to build up the capacity of SOEs, build up the capacity of regulators to take on these kinds of challenges. But, and we're seeing some efforts in that direction. There's lots of programs, bilateral cooperation programs and others that are helping to build up that knowledge base and that cadre of skilled people. But we think there needs to be a more holistic approach across the whole system that we've outlined, including regulators, state-owned enterprises, financial institutions, etc. And that also needs to, of course, be flowing into recipient countries, where governments that are receiving Belt and Road funding need to be able to have those similar mirroring capacities. So there's a big important role that the third parties can play, bilateral donors, NGOs, etc., universities, in helping to engage with actors in China and engage with actors in recipient countries to build up this capacity. That's going to be a critical part of getting the greening part right. Secondly, we need to increase coordination. One of the key findings is that it's just not possible in the current setup for regulators to see everything that's happening. There's a real information asymmetry between people in Beijing and what's happening on the ground. And that creates really great difficulties to improve and implement the stated policies that it would help to green BRI. So the kinds of networks that have emerged, like the Ministry of Ecology and Environment's BRI Green Development Coalition, is a nice step in the right direction, but it needs to go a bit further. It needs to actually link the actors on the ground in recipient countries to decision makers in Beijing in a really open way, so that they're able to overcome this sort of information asymmetry. The core challenge in many parts of the policymaking apparatus across China for any issue is making sure that information flows from where decisions are being implemented to where they're being made. And BRI is very much kind of super example of that disconnect. And the final key part of that is to link the provincial level actors to the national plans. A lot of BRI projects are carried out by provincial level SOEs as well. And provincial governments have played a big role in shaping the direction of the Belt and Road in certain aspects that are core to their own interests. And so a bit more national coordination amongst the various provincial level actors will be an important piece of that as well. Finally, Belt and Road needs to have a more coherent framework on the ground in recipient countries. So currently there are commercial officers from the Ministry of Commerce in Chinese embassies around the world and in Belt and Road countries who are sort of in charge of looking out for commercial contracts. But they're not part of an integrated team across different regulators that are able to monitor the sort of full picture and to help recipient countries navigate the different parts of the Chinese system. So I think there's a real opportunity for more coherence in the Chinese presence in recipient countries as well. And finally, we'll end with this, there's a real need to increase control. Capacity and coordination allow you to increase control, but this is a necessary step as well. So there's sort of soft reporting guidelines for the sustainability practices of many SOEs and for financial institutions through the respective regulators. Those should become more concrete sustainability benchmarks, we think. Part of that might involve giving a substantive role to the Ministry of Ecology and Environment in project approval, at least for certain kinds of high risk, environmentally high impact projects. It'd be great to draw on the expertise and technical acumen of MEE, who is the Chinese agency with most ability to influence and provide advice on those kinds of projects. So could they have a kind of stoplight function for monitoring environmental risks in the same way that NDRC or MOFCOM have a role in monitoring whether investments can go ahead or not? And finally, overcoming the information asymmetry means having some better control over what actually happens on the implementation level. So just as we've seen the Chinese environmental regulators become more proactive in inspecting what's happening on the ground around the country in different at the provincial level and at lower levels of government, so too might we expect to see Chinese environmental regulators do a more proactive job of controlling what their companies are doing abroad. And that's part of realizing the national objectives that are laid out in the Greening Belt and Road policy, but making sure they're flowing through the system all the way down to the level of implementation. So just in sum, we think it's a really critical moment for the Belt and Road, both in the larger geopolitics of how China reinserts itself into the world post the COVID crisis, and also a critical juncture in that where our response on the sustainability level is going through a real do or die kind of moment. So the combination of those two things creates a really unique opportunity for a new way forward on Belt and Road, to follow through on the direction that was established already before the COVID crisis, to give it some real legs for the future. So thank you for your interest in this presentation. I hope you'll find the report of value and interest. We're looking forward to your feedback and questions, either today on the webinar or by email, or other interactions we'll have with you in the future. So thanks for listening, and we look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom and Julio, for sharing your presentation with all of us. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to end the screen share, and I'm going to move into taking, we have quite a few questions in the Q&A, so we'll dig right in. Just take a look at, we have the Twitter, website, and email information. If you need any additional information after the webinar, feel free to reach out to us. We'd like to continue the engagement with the audience. Okay, so we've got quite a few questions here. So why don't we just get started with some of the sort of most kind of pertinent ones. So first, there is a question on coal-fired power plants. So Kriti Jha is asking, why is China investing so heavily in coal-fired power plants in the recipient countries? So maybe, Ju, what have you learned about this issue in doing the research?
Thank you, Johannes. So I think there are kind of two reasons for this. I think the first one is so based on our interview, for a lot of these coal power plants in China domestically, they really have the struggling with the business opportunity there, because there are more and more stringent kind of regulation about the coal power plants in China domestically. So it's hard for them to find new business opportunities. So they seek the overseas opportunities. It's kind of the one aspect of the reason. Another aspect of the reason is the policy bank. The two policy bank we mentioned about, they actually recently have published a paper by the GDP Center at Boston University. They have a paper about this. It basically shows the policy bank also have very strong kind of commercial interest. They think this is a good business for them, essentially speaking. So they are willing to provide the money for the coal power plants to do these projects overseas.
Perfect. Now here we have another question from Tao Wang, whom I should acknowledge is one of the kind of key players at ClimateWorks Foundation for helping us get this started. So Tao is asking, could you please elaborate a bit why concessional loan of Export-Import Bank is less important?
Thank you. So we have, the data is not that transparent, because for both the CDB and the Exim Bank, the complete data are not publicly available. But we have different estimations, and there are some excellent pre-existing paper to disaggregate kind of the proportion. We cannot draw a super clear-cut line between the concessional loans and non-concessional loans, because we do not have the data, but there are different estimations and the different kind of the report based on their own agency show that the concessional loans is not a majority, and actually a relatively non-substantial proportion of the whole loans issued by the Exim Bank.
Great. Next, I have questions on renewable energy. Maybe I'll direct this to Tom. So I'll take two questions at the same time. The first one says, China recently published its first draft energy law, which clearly prioritizes the development and integration of renewable energy. Will this prioritization of renewables also be reflected in China's overseas projects? And if so, how? And there's a similar question on, do you see more potential on kind of sustainable projects like wind and solar in BRI moving forward based on the research and recommendations?
Thanks for those questions. So indeed, the relationship between BRI and China's domestic energy transition is complex, and there's not a linear relationship between the two. So the new draft energy law does have some really good aspirations and steps forward on renewable energy. China's history on renewable energy deployment domestically is very impressive and really world leading. This is one of the big sort of success stories of the larger effort by China in the climate space, is its domestic renewable policy. But of course, that creates a lot of industrial transformations in the country. And so there's a lot of people in China who build coal plants, who work in coal mines, who are otherwise dependent on the incumbent industry. And actually the pressure to green China's domestic energy infrastructure creates additional pressure onto those incumbent actors. So that's the pressure on the government to resolve. It's a real one. It's about unemployed workers. It's about non-performing loans in banks. It's about companies that can no longer function. So in some ways, the energy transition in China creates more incentive for those companies to find new opportunities outside of China, in countries like Bangladesh, in Vietnam, and Indonesia, where demand for energy is also rising, and where these companies feel that they can make some more profit by exporting their current business. And I think going forward, it's going to be really important to bring coherence to that dichotomy, because what works well in China should also be what works well for BRI countries. And actually one of the key lessons of China's development experience is that this transition toward greening energy supplies is a really important thing to get right early, not least for the health benefits, also for the economic development benefits. So I think by greening, creating a bit more standards on greening BRI outflows, China will help to accelerate that process in the recipient countries instead of seeing them as the residual of China's own reform efforts. And that's answers the second question, which is, yeah, it is a huge opportunity to do that.
Great. So next we have another ISEP collaborator, Sun Yishan, is asking about the role of CIDCA in the BRI's decision-making after this recent round of government reform. So what do you think, how is sustainability taken into account in this new agency?
Thanks. So CIDCA is the Chinese International Development Cooperation Agency. It's China's new international development aid organization. And it was created to try to bring a bit more coherence to China's sort of fragmented development aid processes before that. So it's, if you will, the USAID or the DFID or the SIDCA of China. And in theory, this new agency should be providing a key role in helping to identify the priority projects for China's engagement in a country. So they should go to, say, Pakistan or to Indonesia and say, what are the development priorities for this country? How can we align various kinds of Chinese investments toward the goals, development goals of the country and globally? In practice, it's been quite difficult for SIDCA to begin playing that role. It's a brand new agency, and it's sort of created in a way that creates a bit of a power struggle between the Ministry of Commerce, which was sort of in control of the, if you will, the money for development aid, and some of the other actors, the other ministries, and also provincial level actors who were actually in charge of dispersing that kind of that aid. And so because it's kind of been a little bit caught between these sort of ministerial power struggles, it hasn't yet emerged as a kind of a forceful voice in the kind of what projects should go where sort of discussions. And certainly compared to China Development Bank or China Exim Bank or some of the large commercial SOEs, it's not going to be very influential in determining what the priorities should be. And so it actually is a bit of a cautionary tale, because here's a bureaucratic reform that was supposed to bring more coherence, to bring more control to China's international aid efforts. And that's been a little bit stymied by bureaucratic politics. So a bit of a warning sign there.
Okay. Perfect. So we have a very long list of questions, which is exciting, but if I can request to you and Tom, let's keep the answers as short as possible so everybody can hear. So next one I'd like to direct it to you. So Emre Hatipoglu is noting that Professor Kao's work shows that going green sometimes pays off for local administrators in terms of their personal career. promotion and incentives. Do you think these kind of individual incentives for different administrators could help us make BRI more sustainable?
Thank you for this very excellent question. So I think it depends on the type of the actor involved. So I think we think about the project developers, especially in terms of SOE. The two types of SOE. The first type of SOE is central level SOE, which is owned by the central government. The second type of SOE, more than 100,000 actual SOEs are local SOEs, so they are owned by the local governments. So for the career-based incentive, especially at the local level, which a bunch of different literature talk about, is apply for the local SOE. I think also Tom mentioned about the employment kind of consideration for local social stability is also very important part of the incentive for local officials. So for the central SOEs, their main kind of incentive, especially from the perspective of SESEC, is about the profits. So I think that's the reason we also made the policy recommendation is that maybe take more into account of the sustainability issue into the kind of evaluation system of the CSEC for the central SOEs. Yeah, for local SOEs, it may be difficult to do that. But maybe for central one, it's because it's fully in charge of by just one single agency. So it's relatively speaking, maybe easier. But it's very hard to kind of navigate through these domestic bureaucratic politics.
Perfect. And I'm gonna direct you two more questions. So I have one question on if Chinese government actually has diplomats and kind of foreign service officers in these countries working on opportunities for BRI funding. Are they actively doing it? And another one is if the NDRC has a unit that kind of specifically looks at the Belt and Road.
Yeah, that would be helpful. I think one of the reasons when we do the interview, we found that the problem about the information, sharing of the information is really important to improve the governance and the coordination between all these different actors. So I think that would be actually helpful because I think the understaffing kind of problem is very universal for different regulators in both, I think, China and the recipient countries. So that definitely helps.
Okay, perfect. There's a few other, I think, very, very interesting questions that I want to highlight. So Tom, I'm going to ask, direct these questions to you. So the first one is, let's say a few words just about the recipient countries. So who are the main players in those countries that China engages with? And second question then is on this control recommendation. China has always been very careful not to kind of interfere with domestic affairs of other countries. Is there a risk that this might not work given a kind of criticism of neocolonialism and things like this?
Great question. So certainly in many projects around BRI, and arguably most projects, the primary agency for initiating projects lies with actors in recipient countries. So it's not Chinese SOEs that are really picking the projects they want to do and sort of forcing those on recipient countries. It's more recipient countries commercial interests there, possibly political ones, are thinking of what projects do we want to develop here, and then finding ways for to build in relationships with Chinese actors. And oftentimes, in some countries, there's various commercial interests who are really leading that process. So for example, in Malaysia, a lot of Belt and Road projects were created through around the interests of state-owned enterprises in Malaysia, many of which have ties to the Malaysian Chinese diaspora population, the Chinese business population in Malaysia. And that is the actors who are primarily in charge of thinking about what are we going to try to get investment for, as opposed to in the Chinese side. But that's quite different from, for example, in a place like Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, the government has a lot of control over the economy, much more than in China. And a lot of the projects are funded through a kind of special trust fund that the government runs that's basically deciding on what projects happen or not happen in China. And that trust fund is basically controlled by the leader in Kazakhstan. And so there, almost all the agency is on the Kazakhstan government side, and the Chinese government is really just kind of a direct interlocutor with that presidentially backed trust fund. In Pakistan, instead, there's a lot of much more diverse range of interests, where a lot of them are actually operating at the provincial level and getting filtered up through various ministries and planning processes. And the central government in Pakistan has a relatively small role in designating which ones are the priorities. So a lot of different situations across the different countries you've looked at. That'll be true for all BRI projects, but certainly those kinds of actors are often the most important ones for deciding what projects are initiated. And therefore that kind of answers the question on control, because it's actors in recipient countries who are coming up with the project ideas. China can, I think, be a good partner to them by working with them on their national development priorities, but also has a it takes two to tango, and there's a partnership here, and that requires responsibility on the part of both partners. So I think there's a long-standing debate in development studies around what a kind of ownership means at the local level. And I'd like to see, future versions of BRI be able to think about that in a way that's recognizing and affirming the commitment that both countries have made, China and recipient countries, to the global goals that we're all signed up to.
Perfect. So I have another group of questions that I want to direct to you, Tom. So we have one question on the kind of top-down versus bottom-up decision-making. Does it make a difference in sustainability? Is there any evidence on that difference? And then following up on that, to what extent are the central government authorities able to kind of control and direct what SOEs and private companies in China do? Are they actually able to increase this control if they want to?
Great question. So on the top-down versus bottom-up thing, I think there's not a huge difference for sustainability. The core finding of our report is actually that sustainability has very few entry points into any of these decision-making processes. Probably the strongest factor is where in recipient countries you have strong environmental regulators or courts or local NGOs that are kind of really able to push those agendas. That's where they get fed into the decision-making process, but very unlikely to happen from the central actors, either if they're coming bottom up or top down. And then the question, does the central government have the ability to control these projects? It's certainly attenuated, as you mentioned. The ratio of regulators to people to watch and monitor is really low, so there's not that much capacity there. But we think that's exactly why there's a huge need to strengthen the number of people with the capacity to do it and to give them more authority to do so. Because if we're not able to increase that control a bit, we're not going to get a chance to regulate it. And look, it's not perfect. There's never going to be total control, and probably wouldn't even want that to be the case. But we see a lot of low-hanging fruit where a little bit more information, a little bit more capacity, a little bit more control could actually pay a lot of dividends and really give some meaning and substance to the high-level directives around greening BRI.
So, Juyu, I have a question for you here from the audience asking about the recommendation to increase capacity of regulators. So, why has that happened? Why has that not happened yet? What is the bottleneck here? Why is it difficult to do this?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think there are two kind of explanation for this. The first is the more based on the bureaucratic politics in China. So especially at the central level, because a lot of the regulators are central level ministries. So the reason is if they want to increase the number of the staff at the central level ministries, is extremely hard. It's usually kind of the bargaining, negotiation between different stakeholders. The reason is like, for example, for one ministry to increase the budget or the number of staff, all other ministry will think, okay, so we also want to increase our personnel, and that's kind of just a competition between each other. So it's very hard for them to kind of increase the number of the people in each of the ministry. Is kind of bureaucratic politics reason for that. This is the first explanation. The second explanation is, I think for a lot of these regulators, they have the scales. They understand like the specific expertise. And so for the China's overseas projects, and it's a dramatic increase in recent years. So it really takes time for the government to kind of have these kind of supply of the expertise to the people who understand what's going on there, who have the expertise, and that I think that need time for the government to have the supply of the talent for that. So I think that's another reason. Yeah.
Excellent. So we are approaching the end of our time, but of course, I'm going to have to ask, based on the many audience questions about COVID-19 and the Belt and Road. So China has been very active in many of these countries, supporting them dealing with this crisis. How do you think COVID-19 will influence Belt and Road and especially the sustainability aspect? I'll ask Tom, you go first, and then Chu, you can have the final word.
So the big question I think that we don't know the answer to is how quickly Chinese outward investment will increase or decrease in the years to come. And that will be driven by what the kind of macroeconomic situation in China and globally is. Now, if we see the COVID crisis be moving into a more managed phase after the summer and the economies begin picking up again, I think we'll see a sort of return to large volumes of outflows. And therefore the question of how to green them will be absolutely critical. There's another scenario though, where actually the economic crisis is much more severe than that in China and around and globally. Those are reports related. And we see a decline or even a drying up of Chinese outbound investment for a significant period of time. I think that's a more challenging scenario. But in either scenario, there's a huge role that this kind of investment is going to be need to play in driving a safe, sustainable, resilient economic recovery from this crisis. And so it might be challenging for China to provide that, depending on what's happening to the country's economy and the fiscal balance. But there'll be a huge demand from all of the BRI countries for exactly that kind of support. And so to the extent China is able provide that role of investment, that's going to be wanted all the much more. And layer on top of that, this kind of need to rebalance the economy to make it more sustainable going forward, to prevent the kinds of climate disruptions that will aggravate these kinds of disease outbreaks in the future. I see a real kind of master stroke here for creating a more sustainable Belt and Road going forward. If there's ever a time to do it, it's now. And I think if China isn't able to rise to that opportunity, it will be a real it will really hamper the country's ability to project a kind of moving on from the COVID crisis in the way that I think it would like to.
Excellent. Chuyu, is there anything you would like to add to this?
I think that Tom made a very good point in terms of, I think this will be a great opportunity from the Chinese perspective. So I think I think it's very important also to look at when now there will be some further policy made in this issue domain in terms of whether now there'll be more like policy to promote the BRI in the future, maybe this year. So that'll be, I think, give us more detailed information in terms of the direction the BRI, how it will evolve as the next step. Yeah, that'll be very great to look at.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for joining us, and apologies I wasn't able to get through all the questions. Really terrific stuff and a great discussion. Again, we will send all of you the recording of this webinar and the slides after this presentation, and you can find more about our work in the report itself and on the website size-isep.org. We'll keep you updated on this project. We are just halfway with the project, so there will be more. Hopefully we can invite you to another webinar next year when we study the recipient countries. Thanks again for joining, and thanks Tom and Julia for an excellent presentation and taking all these questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much.